Hey, fourth graders, Mrs. Griswold here. Hope all of you guys are staying safe and healthy during this time. It was really great to see some of your faces during your class meetings throughout the week. I hope next week to see a little bit more of you because I really miss seeing you guys every day. Today, we're going to read a story and it's going to help you practice one of your standards that you're working on for your packet for the week. So today, it's going to look a little bit different because I don't have the book in front of me. I have the book online, so I'm going to be sharing my screen with you, but I'll be in the bottom reading aloud and kind of talking through some things as well. So bear with me as I walk through this program. Today we're going to read Henry's Freedom Box, and this book is written by Ellen Levine and it's illustrated by Kadir Nelson. This book is actually a narrative nonfiction text, and this is a special kind of text because it's about a real event based in history, but it represents the nonfiction portion. So what this means is that it's a real event that happened in history, which makes it nonfiction, but it's written in a story way. So it's really special because it will still have characters, setting, problem, and solution, and follow that plot line just like fiction stories do. So when I read this type of book, we need to get our brains ready for this genre. So as I mentioned, even though the story is nonfiction and has real information, it still has characters and a plot that include the problem and solution. So we need to be aware of that when we're reading. So in this story, Henry is a slave who works for his master, and all the time he dreams about freedom, but that dream seems farther away than ever when he's torn from his family and he's put to work in a warehouse. Henry grows up and actually marries, and he has a family, but one day they're torn away from him. So he needs to think of a way to find freedom. I want you to think about a time that you have had a problem in your life. It could be a small problem, could be a large problem, but I want you to pause this video and I want you to think to yourself, how did you respond to that problem? And what did that reveal about your character and who you are as a person? Hopefully, as you were thinking about your problem and how you solved it, you really kind of figured out the steps that you took in order to solve it and what kind of person you are. Are you brave? Are you courageous? Are you determined? The way that you solved that problem might show a little bit about who you are. So today, when we're reading, take a look at our objective. I can identify the problem and solution in a story in order to describe characters so that I can understand that characters reveal their traits by the steps they take to respond to problems. So this seems a little bit wordy, so let's break it down a little bit. We know that word identify means what? Good, it means to find. So we're going to find the problem and solution in a story so we can describe characters. That means so we can really talk about who they are and talk about those adjectives that we can use to really show who they are. And that will help us understand that characters reveal or also show their traits by the steps they take to respond to problems. So what that means is that we're going to be looking at the problem and solution in a text, and we're going to look at the steps that the characters took to solve that problem, because the steps that characters take to respond to a challenge or a problem really can reveal or really show who they are and give us a little bit more about their inside and what kind of traits they have. So as we read today, I want you to be able to identify the main problem and solution in the story. Once you've determined the problem, then we're going to think about the steps that Henry took in order to solve his problem, and then think to ourselves, what do his actions reveal about who his traits and who he is? So as we're reading, I want you to keep in the back of your mind the problem and solution in the story and the steps that Henry takes to solve this problem. Henry's Freedom Box. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from the trees like slave children are torn from their families. One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them down to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners. Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would set him free. But the master said, "You are a good worker, Henry. I'm giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he didn't say thank you. That would have been a lie. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. "Free bird, happy bird," Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field. The leaves swirled in the wind. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. Do not tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the new boy. He poked the boy with a stick. If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you. Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little baby, then another and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he will sell our children," she said. Henry sat very still. Uh-oh. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy had said. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." "No!" cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco," the boss poked Henry. Henry twisted tobacco leaves. His heart twisted in his chest. So I'm going to stop right there. Can you identify what the problem is? Good. So far, we know that the major problem in the story right now is that Henry's children were sold in the slave market. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves was tied together. The owner shouted at them. Henry looked for his family. "Father, father!" Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her at the same moment she saw him. When he wiped away his tears, Nancy too was gone. So what's part of that major problem? Not only were his children sold, but now his wife is being sent away as well. I wonder how Henry's going to solve this problem to lead us to the solution. Let's keep reading to find out. Henry no longer sang. He couldn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree and into the open sky, and Henry thought about being free. But how? As he lifted a crate, he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. They met early the next day at an empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. "I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves," he said. James stared at the box, then at Henry. "What if you cough and someone hears you?" "I will cover my mouth and hope," Henry said. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, "To William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Henry would be delivered to his friends in Pennsylvania. Then he printed on the crate in big letters, "This side up with care." Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or the work boss would think he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger, but Henry knew it wasn't bad enough. He opened a bottle of oil of vitriol. "No!" cried James. Henry poured it on his hand. It burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand. They arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. If we were reading and you were wondering what that word vitriol meant, we can use our context clues real quick so we kind of get a better idea of what Henry did to himself. It said he opened a bottle of oil of vitriol and it burned his skin to the bone. So we can infer that that word vitriol is some sort of acid or something that can burn skin. So we know that's one way that Henry is trying to lead to the solution of making himself free. The sun was not yet up when Henry climbed into the box. Ready, he said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box into the baggage car. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again. Upside down, he heard waves splashing. This must be the steamboat headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst, but he was afraid to move. Someone might hear him. Goodness, look at him trapped in this little box. Could you imagine? I'm tired of standing, someone said. Why don't we move that box and sit on it, said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck. Now he was on his right side, now on his left, and suddenly right side up. What do you think is in here? Said the first man. Mail, I guess, said the other. I am mail, thought Henry, but not the kind they imagine. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in the railroad car, this time head up. He fell asleep to the rattling song of train wheels. He awoke to loud knocking. Henry, are you all right in there? The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and stood up. 4 men smiled at him. Welcome to Philadelphia. At last, Henry had a birthday. March 30th, 1849, his first day of freedom. And from that day on, he also had a middle name. And everyone called him Henry Box Brown. And this author's note it kind of explains about the slave situation in the United States and that this actually was a real story. So while we were reading, we identified the problem. We know that Henry and his family were sold, or not Henry and his family, we know that his family was sold and Henry was left alone and that he really wanted freedom. So let's think about what was the solution. What did he do in order to solve the problem and gain his freedom? I'm going to give you guys a second to pause the video and stop and think. Good. We know that Henry came up with the idea to mail himself to Philadelphia, where he was able to then be free. So that was the solution to his problem. So we know that our learning goal is to identify the problem and solution, which we've now done. But now let's take a look at the steps that the character, which is Henry, took to solve this problem so we can figure out what kind of traits he might have. So if we were going through the story, and we know that it's always good to go back into the text, we know that once he decided to mail himself, that he came up with this idea. After he thought about the happy times and he was trying to get through that, he came up with this idea to mail himself. When he was coming up with this idea, he then knew he needed a way to trick his master into not thinking he had run off. So he poured that oil or that acid, whatever that was, onto his hand. So that tells us a little bit about himself. We then know that when he mailed himself, he was stuck inside of this box where his face was hot, his eyes ached, imagine his body. We know that he was then tossed all around by these guys. We know he was tossed around by the mail carrier. So there was a couple of steps he had to take in order to reach the solution. So if we stop right there, what do some of these actions show us about Henry? Once again, we know that he had to Try to think of happy times. He came up with the idea to mail himself to a place where there were no slaves. When he mailed himself, he went through those challenges and hardships of being stuck in that box, of being tossed around. So I want to show you guys a resource that will be available in Schoology as well. And it is a list of character traits. And it can these are those adjectives or those traits that can describe a character. So this chart kind of tells us about if they're nice, mean, sad, if they're positive, negative traits, things like that. So if I'm thinking about Henry and the steps that he took to solve this problem, I know one, that he does a lot, and I also would think that he's pretty confident in order to have to escape and even come up with this clever idea of mailing himself. So if I were to take 2 or 3 character traits to describe Henry, to reveal his character, I would say that he is hardworking, because he worked hard throughout the whole story, and then even at the end, he worked hard to think of that solution to mail himself. I would also say that he's very brave, because in order to escape and put yourself in a box, I think that takes a lot of bravery of a person. And then I would also say that he's courageous, because this really shows the word bravery, but I think to the next level. He had to show courage in order to really go through with this plan. So these are the steps that we can take in order to really understand the character's trait. So we know that Henry is brave and courageous and hardworking based on the steps he took to solve his problem. Your job this week is you're going to be reading a story in your packets that were sent home, and you're going to see the same kind of activity that we just did together. It's going to be the same standard that we just practiced. So my challenge for you is to take this information and do an awesome job while you're completing your first week's packet. I know you guys are going to do a really nice job, and I can't wait to see the work that you guys come up with. All right, get to it. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.